Okay, let's get you ready for exam one. I understand without a textbook to go back and review for some of the topics we talked about, it can be a little bit tricky. So what I'm going to do in this review video is I'm going to point out, and I guarantee you I'm covering every test question on the exam, some areas where you want to make sure that you understand the information. The exam is going to start off with 20 multiple choice questions, and then there'll be a series of short answer and matching questions. There'll be two vocabulary words on the exam, and I can guarantee you these are not marginal vocabulary words. They're words that you've heard in the class lectures multiple times and that you should have a good understanding of. So that's what you can expect. Time won't be an issue. People usually finish the exam in 45 minutes or less, but I'll give you probably an hour and a half to finish the exam. So I don't think you're going to have any problems with time. Let's dive in. So again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm going to cue you to what you should make sure you know to study on the exam. If you see me scroll past slides, that means there's nothing from that slide or those topics on the exam. So to get started, I would know how many barrels of oil there are. I'm sorry, how many gallons of oil there are in a barrel. You're also going to want to know the difference between light and heavy, sweet and sour. You're going to want to know which is more valuable in the pair and why it's more valuable. I spent a lot of time and had you read a book chapter and watch a video about the beginnings of oil, and I asked you the question in class, tell me several things that are the same today in the industry that were established in the first 10 years or so of the industry, and I would make sure that I had several of those at my fingertips to answer questions. Nothing about Baku, Standard Oil. There is a question about Standard Oil, and so I would make sure I know what stream they started in and the significance of Standard Oil. I do not have any test questions in here about what year this happened or anything like that, but when we get to the black giant, again, we watched a video and we talked about some significant regulatory initiatives that came about as they coped with the black giant and the surplus of oil that it provided. I would make sure I remembered those and could articulate why they were important. Nothing about the Seven Sisters, but understanding the Seven Sisters and how it led to OPEC being formed could be essential. For OPEC, I would make sure I understand this slide and the slide that follows, who's in, who's not in, and what kind of reserves they have, and also what kind of production that they have. Again, I'm not going to ask you for a specific number so much as just a sense of what is true and what is not true about OPEC. Also, there's an article that I had you read about the Saudi and Russia OPEC relationship and the price jousting that goes on, and make sure that you're aware of that. That will help you answer some questions. I have this series of charts on the history through price. What I want you to do is to be generally familiar with each of these major things. Now, I'm not going to say like, what year did the Asian flu occur and ask you to cite a year that went with it. But I'm going to expect you to know that, for example, the Asian flu came after the Iraq-Kuwait war and before the generally improving economy and the growth of the China market. So don't worry about memorizing the specific years. Just know why they occurred and know why the price changed. So if you simply understand each of these general topics and what was happening, then you'll be good to go there. Obviously, supply, demand, and speculation is a pretty critical concept. And again, here I don't want you to memorize the different numbers. What I want you to remember is who are the top oil producing countries. And if a country has huge reserves and small production, that might also help you out with some questions. Actually, I eliminated that question, so scratch that. Again, there could be a question about sweet versus sour and heavy versus light and what makes each valuable. And then a big issue that we talked about in class is why did U.S. oil production take off in 2010? And I've got some other slides that really show how that happened. So you need to be very familiar with this slide so that you can explain it. Nothing there. I do talk about the change in electrical generation, and remember that the growth in natural gas and its price competitive is really what's pushing coal out. although certainly the growth of renewables is also factoring into that, um, and also some environmental regulations. But again, it's basically market forces in the low price of gas. And then I expect you to know what are some of the environmental consequences of that shift from coal to natural gas off of this chart. Don't need to know those numbers. Took out the question on midstream, so don't worry about that. I do expect you to know where the major oil and gas plays are. So I expect you to know where the Bakken is. I expect you to know where the Permian is, the Eagle Ford. In terms of oil, the Haynesville is not a big gas or a oil play, but it is in terms of gas. And then when we get into the gas plays, I want you to add to that the Marcellus area up here, the Barnett Shale that's mainly around the Fort Worth area, and I've already talked about Haynesville. And obviously, there's a little bit of gas associated with all of the oil production that I talked about earlier. And so I would not be surprised if I don't have a map on the exam with a bunch of numbers on it and says which number is the Permian Basin, which number is the Marcellus, which number is the Haynesville. So it's very important to me that you know where these places are located, because in the industry, people will throw out the name and expect you to understand that. Also know where there's been, in here I told you to make sure you know what are the major producers of oil. And obviously the Permian is dwarfing everything else, and offshore is about another 2 million barrels a day. The Permian is even dwarfing that. And also know that the Marcellus is been the major growth in the natural gas or the shale gas production. It's grown in other places, but the Marcellus is where you can see it's gone from literally nothing to a dominant share. Nothing on that slide. Nothing on any of these slides about company names. Now we get into the issue of what's happened in 2020. So understand the conditions of the Saudi-Russia price war and how even before, this is, I clipped this out of a CNBC, and it talks about under pressure since late January as concerns over the coronavirus emerged. But really, before the coronavirus emerged, you had the Saudi-Russia price war that kicked off in early March that really started oil decline. And you can see they failed to agree on production cuts, and Saudi said we're actually going to increase it, and boom, prices went down, and then it just got worse for a while, and then it started to get better once I think people got a grip on that. We talked about the huge collapse in demand associated with COVID and what that's done to the price. And so then the question becomes, why is cutting supply so hard? This is an important concept. We talked about this in class. I would make sure that you're up on understanding why cutting supply is so hard, particularly for operators in the Permian Basin and other places in the United States. And then to segue into Mark Carter's slides, I just want to remind you that because of this price drop, it's been really tough financially for the oil and gas companies. And you can see that many companies cannot pay their debt. It's one thing to disappoint your equity investors, but when you have bank debt that you can't pay, that's a huge deal. And because of that, we see a lot of Chapter 11 bankruptcies. Okay, let me call up Mark Carter's slides. All right, with Mark's slides where he was talking about his company and what they did in 2020, he talked about the huge collapse in price and how that affected intrinsic value, which is the value of cash. And how do you determine cash flows for oil and gas companies? It's future production times future prices. But what happened is when the price goes down, cash flow goes down. And this gets into a key issue of a bank's worst nightmare. And Mark talked about how what happens is a lot of these companies that had bank loans, when the banks see this decrease in oil prices, they realize that these oil companies aren't going to be able to pay back their loans and they aren't going to be servicing them. And then he talked about the condition there where the loan to the bank, and the banks are usually pretty conservative, but the price decrease was so severe that the loan to the bank was more than the value of the asset, which is the oil well, because of the low prices. And then he talked about how his company was able to use its relationships with a banker and another company to make an acquisition. So I would make sure that you understand that story. Okay, we're on to geology. So Dr. Meadow gave us this review in class, and I can tell you that these first 5 slides, where he's talking about the petroleum system and conventional versus unconventional, are going to be very important to you. Nothing on this, even though there's no test question on this, but again, remember that oil wells decline over time, and that's a big deal. We'll talk about this topic more later in the course, so no quiz questions there. He talked a lot about well logs. Great information, but there's nothing on the exam about well logs. There is a question on the exam about decline curve analysis. Again, you don't need to get hung up on these so much on what these acronyms mean, but I do think it's important how he talked about when you start this process of water flooding and pressure maintenance, or you go into thermal issues, this IOR and EOR stuff, that basically when you start to do that, the decline curve shift, and you can't use a decline curve before that. And that's why it says it will not be accurate if ongoing operations change in the future, such as infill drilling or IOR or EOR. Know that decline curve is most accurate with mature fields and established trend. Note that decline curves is important for doing, if you're a publicly traded company, you have to forecast your reserves based on a decline curve analysis. But decline curve analysis isn't perfect science. It's not 100% accurate. It's not even close to 100% accurate. And you can even see here, it develops a range of forecasts. So it's not like getting that one right number. It's about giving you an idea. Even though for things like reporting the annual reserves, you do give quote unquote one right number. And again, generating a range of outcomes. Great points here about people tend to be overly optimistic, but nothing on the exam. Again, the difference between conventional and unconventional, I would know these slides very, very well. I've already driven home. If you know where everything is on this slide and add the Haynesville and there's the Barnett, then you know your basins. I would know this fracking fluid very, very well. One thing I want to point out to you is the mixture is 90% water, 9.5% sand, and 5.5% other fluids. And so what that tells you is of the other fluids, or of the fluid, it's like 99% water, more than that, because you got 5% other stuff and 90% water, and then almost 10% sand. And these things are there just to make the frac work better, to decrease velocity, or I'm sorry, to decrease friction, so that you can get maximum pressure. And then for the disposal, make sure you understand earthquakes, that it's not the fracking that generates earthquakes that are noticeable. It is the disposal wells that are associated with the fluids that come, the produced water that comes out of the wells. Talked about that. And then as much as I am focused on the Permian, the Eagle Ford and South Texas, I'd like you to be very familiar with this chart and also understand how this affects the geology, because this oil, this formation is a little bit at a lower depth, therefore it generated oil, and as the formation continues to the south, the source rock is deeper and deeper, buried deeper and deeper, and as it gets buried deeper and deeper, temperatures increase, and instead of oil, you get dry gas, and then wet gases. You're going through that progression of less oil, more gas as you move down in depth, and you can see that on that chart as well. It is important that you know about the difference between the Delaware Basin and the Midland Basin and the Permian. And the reason that's important to me is because if an operator says to you which basin they're in, they expect you to know which side of the Permian you're on. And so Dr. Meadows got this great chart that you see. This is the Delaware, and this is the Midland Basin. And so the Midland Basin lies entirely within Texas. The Delaware Basin is in both Texas and New Mexico. But if you're drilling in New Mexico, you're drilling in the Delaware Basin. We'll talk about this later, but the reason these things are so different is the amount of water that's produced from a well in the Delaware Basin is typically much more than in the Midland Basin. So it's not like they're exactly the same, and that's why it's important to know what we're talking about. And no questions on the BP energy outlook. We'll just keep it to the geology. Okay, one last video to cover. As important and as enlightening as all these slides are, there's no exam questions on them. But when we get to this question, or this slide, understanding who's the lessor, who's the lessee, what consideration is, what royalty is, and the importance of a working interest, having that vocabulary straight is important. And then you get into some of the basic terms, and you will see that the words on this chart, you're going to want to understand what all of these words mean, because there's several questions having to do with that. If you're hazy on what any of these clauses mean, they're actually in the Fundamentals of Petroleum textbook, or you could just Google them because they're very clear on that. And then remember that in terms of the consideration, the bonus it's usually paid per acre, and royalties in the beginning, 1/8 was the traditional royalty, and it's still a royalty on some of the federal lands, but privately nobody ever settles for a 1/8 anymore. You'll see some numbers that say they're up to 1/3, but I've never personally heard of a royalty higher than 1/4. And as interesting as this material is, there are no specific questions on that either. I'd recommend you look through all of Mr. Carter's slides just because he takes a different take on it than my other slides do, but it does a really nice job of repeating a couple of key concepts. And so I think just flipping through these slides are going to help you quite a bit, and you're going to get the terminology right of who's the lessor, who's the lessee. And then for sure, again, here's these clauses that you see played out, and that helps you understand, be able to answer these questions as they come up. And understand, if you work through these problems, it is going to help you answer a couple of questions on the exam. And nothing on this, nothing there on the exam. Again, it's going to help you understand how things work, and I look forward to a fascinating conversation from him in class. And if I decide to change a question based on this conversation, I'll let you know. That's it. Again, I've tried to just highlight for you the areas I intend to emphasize with the exam. I've discussed every test question in this video, and it'll be 20 multiple choice and then a variety of short answers and matching for the rest. Good luck.